And welcome. Tonight, we're going to have our second talk supporting the exhibition Tony Parker's Heroes and Villains. And my name is Sean Yuan, and I'm Associate Curator of Asian Art at this museum. And tonight, I'm hosting this talk on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Emily Sano, who is the Senior Advisor for Asian Art. She is the curator at this wonderful exhibition. Before we start the talk, I just want to remind you, please silence your phone. And for those who joining us online tonight, you can type out your questions and the speaker will answer them after his talk. Heroes and Villains is probably among one of our most well-attended exhibitions so far. Of course, I still need to confirm the total attendance after exhibitions closed in early September. Since the exhibition opened, every day I saw lots of parents took their kids to our museum to see the exhibition. And this exhibition is focused on the figures that truly defined the pop culture of this country. However, if we look deeper, it is not too hard to realize that the idea of American pop culture is largely formed by multiple sources from other cultures. Let's take the Ninja Turtle, for example. The name ninja is from Japanese culture. Of course, their dress, the weapons they use, also inspired by Japanese culture. The name of these turtles, like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, of course, European. The core values promoted by Ninja Turtles are deeply rooted in American society. All these great cultures are represented by fantastic artworks on view in our permanent galleries. So I encourage you, if you have time after you look at this exhibition, please spend a few minutes looking through our permanent galleries. Our speaker tonight is Professor Jamon Halvaksz from University of Texas in San Antonio. In addition to the talk tonight, Professor Halvaksz will also give a gallery talk on August 23rd from 5 to 5:30 p.m. The tickets is still available. The talk is free to the members. This talk on August 23rd will examine the artistry and the fandom of the superhero subculture. In the meantime, exploring what makes a superhero so super. Now, let me introduce Professor Halvaksz. Dr. Halvaksz is the Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Texas in San Antonio. He has conducted a field work in Papua New Guinea since 1998. His research has focused on the agriculture, conservation areas, as well as gold mining along the upper Bulolo River of Morobe province. Since 2015, Professor Halvaksz has taught a class titled The Anthropology of Superheroes, exploring what it means to participate in the superhero subculture. He's also the author of The Gardens of Gold, Placemaking in Papua New Guinea, published by University of Washington Press in 2020. Now let's welcome Professor Corwitz.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm not used to talking to a mic, so bear with me. I want to thank the museum for having me. It's a great opportunity to talk about two of my biggest passions, one being anthropology and the other being superheroes. As was just stated, I have done research for a long time in the South Pacific, where I work with communities of Yangai speakers in Morobe province. I've been working there since 1998, and I continue to go back. I haven't been back since the pandemic began, but on a regular basis, I go back to do research and comparatively between two different communities. One is the beneficiary of a large industrial gold mine, and the other is participants in a conservation area that is now defunct. But I do a variety of different things. Mostly I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I talk to people, I gather data from interviews. I do garden surveys, I count the number of coffee trees in the community, and count the number of yam mounds planted in the community. I go and do this kind of work and sort of a mixed methods approach, combining what's called GIS and ethnographic research methods. in terms of where that's at, it's just above the historical gold mining town of Wow, in the Upper Bulolo Valley, as was mentioned. And I published on a variety of different topics, everything from gold mining to marijuana to photography. And so my research interests have largely not been about superheroes, but recently I started thinking about superheroes. And a lot of it I can attribute to my family. I constantly in my classes before 2015 was making reference to superheroes as examples. And my wife and child who are in this audience tonight said to me, why don't you just teach a class on it? And I thought, well, there's no way that would work. But it did. And I've been teaching this class at UTSA as often as I can. Usually I require students to create their own superheroes, and then they dress up at those on Halloween. And then we all attend Comic-Con together, and it's a mass sort of survey course where we go to Comic-Con, we interview people and try to understand what the anthropology of superheroes means. The problem, of course, is that there are no superheroes. And so as a cultural anthropologist, I study living people. I work with living people. I get to know living people. And there aren't superheroes really to go ask questions. I can't find an actual Peter Parker or a Clark Kent, right? So I have to find other ways of engaging with that audience. And part of that is through the study of cosplay and the fandom that surrounds the various characters. So this exhibit here is a perfect case, and I'm going to be encouraging my students to attend and see it before it leaves. I'm teaching again this fall, but that sort of takes us to the topic of today, where I'm trying to sort of explain one of the main points I make in the class about superheroes, and that is they really form a modern mythology. So today I have three topics I'm going to address. The first is, what is myth? And for that, I'll probably be reading mostly because it's a little bit of theory. And if I don't read it, I will ramble on about structural functionalism and practice theory, and we'll get lost in the weeds. So I'm going to keep myself on task with that text. But then we'll turn to looking at myths as an active part of daily life and thinking about how we do see myths interacting with us still. And I'll be using an example from my research in Papua New Guinea. And then we'll turn finally to think about superheroes as a modern mythology, or what I mean by a super mythology. So begin with the topic of myth. My objective today is not to retell a history of myth or theories about myth, but to highlight how mythological thinking can help us understand the superhero. So what do I mean by mythological thinking? Alfred Wallace, an anthropologist of religion, defined myth as a narrative that identifies, describes, and explains the origins, interests, and powers of the supernatural entities of the pantheon, or gods, and gives an account of their relation to man, which justifies and rationalizes the rituals that are performed in their name. It's a very serviceable definition, very basic. It's not that complicated to try and understand. But the problems with this definition is it's very static. And it's very much based upon understanding myth as text. And as a result of that, it becomes what we would call structural or functional in sort of orientation, in that it seeks to compare mythologies, or it seeks to see myths as texts themselves, and not how people live and practice a mythology. How do people actually enact those in their daily lives? And so there are certainly scholars that view myths as stories to be understood structurally, Levi-Strauss, for those of you who are familiar with the literature, or purely functional, that myths merely serve as an explanation for the unknown, just so stories that sort of tell us, oh yeah, well, where does fire come from? Here's a mythology about that origin. But these views tend to ignore the social context and practices that are associated with myths, that myths actually have meaning and relevance for people as they live out their daily lives. And this is true of superheroes, I will argue. To get at how myths are lived and experienced, we have to move beyond such functional approaches. And as a first waypoint in our own journey today, we might consider the mythic archetypes of Carl Jung. While I don't really find his structural psychoanalytic approach compelling, what he does call attention to is the work that myths perform, and to the hero myths that form the basis of the contemporary superhero. He observed that, and this is the quote here, myths and fairy tales give expression to unconscious processes, and their retelling causes these processes to come alive again and be recollected. thereby reestablishing the connections between conscious and unconscious. So how do myths come alive for an audience, speaking to some unknown desire? They do so for Jung by connecting to one of the 12 archetypes, ideals that he felt were structured into our very being as a species, or what he called the collective unconsciousness. Contemporary neuroscience and other scholars would question whether or not this is possible, but still, his archetypes speak to common narratives that we are all familiar with: the hero, the villain, the everyman, the outlaw. Archetypes of the hero was also subject to Joseph Campbell's analysis of the hero's journey, and many of you are probably familiar with Campbell's influence on Star Wars, and much of the Star Wars mythology follows that hero's journey that Joseph Campbell laid out. What interests me here is not the archetype per se, but the idea that myths, and specifically hero myths, speak to us. They do something for us. In retelling them, in watching the films, in reading the stories, they come alive again for us. And they do evoke something in us, be it belief, wonder, understanding, or awe. The Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade, I always have trouble with his name, viewed this speaking to us as something more than relating to a shared abstract unconsciousness like Jung did. Moving away from these sorts of explanations, Eliade focused on the work that myths do as symbolic vehicles. He noted that in imitating the exemplary acts of a god or a mythic hero and acting them out, or simply by recounting their adventures, we detach ourselves from profane time, the daily life, everyday sort of experiences, and magically re-enter a great time or a sacred time. For Eliade, this detachment or return to some sort of eternal space, such as dream time in Australian Aboriginal culture, is part of the point of mythology. It views myths as active agents, things that actually matter to us as we experience them and live them. When we read about like Greek and Roman myths, we don't think about how people would have lived the lives adhering to those mythologies as much, but those mythologies meant something to people in much the same way that contemporary modern myths do. A long history of Pacific scholarship, where I do my research, has highlighted how myths as symbolic systems play an active role in human and non-human agency. As Jimmy Weiner, an anthropologist, noted in his discussion of Foy myths, they both encapsulate and mediate relationships between people. They make the relationship between people possible, and between people and things. While maybe functional as well, it is important to recognize how these stories inform the actions of people and communities. And we're going to be asking, how do superheroes do the same thing? Hero myths are a particular type of mythology, often recounting the deeds and trials of some greater than average person. These are characteristically tales of times past, historical figures that have been mythologized into something greater. But in their retelling, they come to us and inspire again. So here I have sort of images from various locations of mythologies that have similar sorts of historical figures that have been mythologized into something greater. The Monkey King, Mami Watu, and the Buddha. You can think of other religious iconography as well as having similar sorts of mythological connections. And obviously, when we walk around the museum like the one we're in, one of the ones that you were always going to see is the tales of Hercules, or Hercules, as the Greeks would have called him, and his 12 labors. This is from a sarcophagus in the Roman, in the third century of the Roman times, and it just depicts the various things that Hercules would have done as part of his 12 labors that made him into this demigod, that made him into this great character. When we walk around the floor here, where we're in this museum, we can find these myths in a case that's just around the corner here, where depictions of his feats as a Greek mythical hero is on display. And I've just put a sample of them up with some really bad photography because I was trying to take it through that plexiglass. It's not really all that, it doesn't lend itself to it so much, but you have Hercules arriving at at Mount Olympus, being greeted by Athena, his defeating of the lion, and his fighting of the Hydra, three of the feats that he is said to have accomplished. What's interesting to me about Hercules is he really is a superhero. He is a Greek superhero in that And then he's also a superhero in the Marvel universe as well, as many of you probably know. But for the Greeks, he was a heroic figure. And like many other mythologies, it's not just limited to the Greeks. We find discussions of, obviously, he gets retold as a Roman myth, an Etruscan myth. We have stories of Hercules and Hercules type tales in Germanic and Egyptian traditions as well. It's a very common mythology that gets retold and retold and reinvented. And for the people who are reinventing and retelling it, they're very much removed from that origin, and he becomes this godlike figure. There were cults to Hercules in the Roman times that devout and worshipped him and saw him as an inspiration. And we continue to see him as an inspiration, often portrayed in cinema and film and TV shows by some beefy, muscular guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger or The Rock. And then we also have Ryan Gosling. I don't know how he fits into that, but the idea, and we're not done telling these stories. Guy Ritchie has announced that he's doing a live action Hercules, which will be a derivative of the Disney version of Hercules, which was a derivative of the mythical story. So we keep on retelling this tale. Why do we find the story of a great hero like this so compelling? What compels us to want to know this story? What compels people to want to act it out? I haven't seen the Three Stooges one, but I can imagine what that one's like. He's also a villain and a supervillain in the comic universe. And when we think about the first appearance of Hercules in the comics, he was a villain. He was accomplishing one of his 12 labors and stealing the girdle from the Amazons, and having achieved that, he imprisons the Amazonian women. They then revolt and fight against him, and they vow to wear bracelets around their wrists to show their freedom from those chains that bound them, right? And so he appears as a villain, but then he gets recovered in Marvel and DC as a superhero, eventually in the Marvel universe becoming an Avenger. And we anticipate, and I'm not going to give any spoilers in this, but we anticipate he'll be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the near future, if he isn't already. But the idea of Hercules as a hero, he sort of epitomizes much of what we think about with mythologies. They continue to be retold. They continue to have a life of their own. And for my own research, myths possess both explanatory power and sources of action in this world. They change and adapt as Hercules does, and are not limited to a fixed structure. This is important as we consider the superhero. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Papua New Guinea, where I do my work. And what I want to talk about, and if my students were here, they would laugh, because I want to talk about yams. I'm known for talking about yams. And when I say yams, I'm not talking about the sweet potatoes that you guys eat at Christmas and the holidays and say, oh, that's a yam. It's not a yam. It's a completely different genus. And I can go on and on about that, so I'll cut it off. But the USDA allows us to call it yams, and no, they're not. And if you look at it carefully, the can says sweet potatoes and syrup. A true yam is a different kind of plant. It grows from a vine that has to twine up a stick. It has to be cared for. And in Biangai mythology, their cultural hero, and at his death, gave them the yam. The first man, according to the people I work with, whose name I can't share with you because the myth is still active and they don't want that name shared widely, or the locations or other details about his story. But the first man was a cannibal king. And he gave rise to all of the humanity that exists. All of Biangai, the gentleman here in the photo, and his son behind him, they are descendants from this first man. But his proclivity for eating eating children and others kind of annoyed his sisters, right? So they plotted and they killed him. And at his death, he said, I will return in a form that will provide for the Biangai into the future. And from his grave grew the first vines of the yam. And thus, when Biangai are planting the yam, as my friend is doing here, he's saying magic that enchants it and connects him to him. That mythology is still alive and active for him. He is planting something that he considers, Biangai will say, it's our bone, it's who we are, it's part of our very being. They consume yams at funerary events as the first harvest. It's always has to be a funerary event or some other formal celebration. It can be a wedding as well, but typically funerals are planned around the first harvest of a, not the initial burial, but the sort of finishing ceremonies that are done. And so planting this yam here is more than just planting a yam. It's in very much a connection to this object, this thing. That mythology continues to inform how Biangai think and conceptualize this. I think that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight with this research. And it's not something that has ended. One of the things I did in my research is I gave out my camera to a sample of individuals and had them take photos. And this was back in 2001. So it was on a roll of film with 24 photos on it. And so they took the photos. I then took the camera, the film, got it developed, brought it back and interviewed them about the photos. So I did that with a lot of people. And then I chose one person who was not Biangai, who lived with the Biangai, looking after the property and coffee gardens of a Biangai man who worked at the mining company. So he wasn't there. And he needed a caretaker that he could trust. And so he asked this gentleman from a different language group to stay in his household, and look after his crops and everything while he was away, and watch his house. And so while he's doing this, I asked him to take these photos, and he takes photos mostly of the house he's staying in, because that's the thing he knows. That's the place that I told him to take photos of places that mean something to you. And he took photos of his house and garden and his family. And then one photo only he took outside of his household area. And that was this photo here, on the far side. He had, they had come down to the river. The river sort of runs between him and the people on the other side. He'd come down to the river, and they were going to do laundry, and they were going to have lunch and then relax in the heat of the day. You don't want to be in the coffee garden or in a garden in the middle of the day. It's really intense. And so they were going to relax a little bit through the heat of the day, and then go back to work. And so this is where they go every day. And he thought, hey, this is a great photo. He had heard a noise on the other side of the river, and he thought maybe someone was stealing papaya. So he went over to check and make sure. And he turned back and he said, hey, this is a great photo. And that's what he told me about it. He said, this is why I took this photo. It's a place we spend every day. It's a great spot. And that was all he said. But then he showed the photo to his host. His host said, wait a second. The problem of it, you're being watched. The head of a man can be, once you see it, in the background there, is floating above them and watching over him, the host said. And this photo is revealing that the head of that man, and you need to be careful because he knows that you're not supposed to be there. So that was the initial reaction. The photo caused quite a stir. People started sharing it, looking at it, and everyone wanted to see the photo. And a story started to emerge that was a bit different, though. This wasn't just the head of a man watching. This was the head of the first man. And the first man, in the retelling of this story, did not just promise the yam. He also promised gold. And this head is telling them where to dig. This head is telling them where to go. So the myth continues to have an impact. There was a mini gold rush that occurred just below this in the stream that I can't have a pointer, I don't think. Is there a pointer from this? There is. There's a stream that runs right down through here. And there was a mini gold rush that occurred shortly thereafter. As people thought, well, the first man's head appeared there, we should go check. And lo and behold, there was gold. And so my point in showing all of this is that mythologies aren't just something that are past, and they're not just so stories. They're something more. They're lived and experienced by people. So how do we see that with superheroes is the question that I'm posing for you today. Superheroes do the same thing. They tell stories that are retold and reimagined over and over again. Now, I love this. I want to point out the image of the Iron Yam that one of my students in my superhero class drew, because I think it's just adorable. But superheroes do the same thing. Superheroes as myths are heroic journeys. They offer foundational stories for the origins of those powers. They are retold and reimagined over and over again. They carry meaning. They are symbolic. They provide moral instruction. With great power comes great responsibility. Any fan of the comic books will know that line. and know who it's associated with, and know what it means. That guy right there. It's an active agent in people's lives. That last one's a little harder to prove, and I'll do some work at the end here to try and prove that. But these stories have a great deal of importance for people. Thing about them is they don't speak to the past. We can't say, "Oh yeah, I knew Superman growing up," right? You knew him as a character, but there's no sort of actual person that story is based upon. It's all a fiction, and we know it's a fiction. We don't have a belief that maybe there's people out there who believe that Superman exists as adults. Maybe there's people out there who believe that there is a spider out there biting people and giving them superpowers. But we know that not to be the case. We hope it can be, but we know that there isn't actually the possibility for this. So they're different from myths in that important way. We don't believe in them. We don't have faith in them in the way we would have in our religious traditions. But they're like other myths then. But what I argue with super myths is that they are present, future oriented and not past, present, future oriented. They are focused upon aspirations. What do we want to live like? What worlds do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where you can be a superpowered individual and solve problems? Yeah, I think we do. We aspire to that. That's one of the reasons why we have these mythologies. What futures do we wish to inhabit is what I think super myths ask us. What do we want to see? And so we can turn to Grant Morrison, who is those of you who read the comic books will know who Grant Morrison is, a comic book creator who reimagined the X-Men, the Justice League, Batman, and amongst others. But he also created a class of comics that are called activist oriented. And they have a moral message that's very intentional. He himself is vegan, and he created the Animal Man, a vegan, and the stories often emphasize the value of animals. His graphic novel, We Three, if you're an adult, I really recommend that, not for the children in the room, but it is about a cute little bunny and a kitty cat and a dog, and they get weaponized by the military and go on a rampage. That's very graphic, but it's a beautifully illustrated book. He saw superheroes as new masks of new gods through which we seek to relate ourselves into the wonders of existence. But I think he would also agree that these can be active social agents. Otherwise, he wouldn't be writing books like the Animal Man or We Three. He sees them as being something more. So, like other myths, they are foundational. They tell stories of origins. Not all of them are like Superman, which is just an alien that comes from another planet, or other sort of fanciful sort of creation stories. Many of them, if you read them carefully, are about ordinary people that something extraordinary happens to, and they're challenged to become something greater. Anybody could be Steve Rogers. Anybody could be Peter Parker. It's possible. And that possibility lives in us as we read them and tell the stories. We imagine that we can possibly be the scrawny bookworm who then becomes Spider-Man, right? We imagine we can be Steve Rogers if we only had the superhero serum. The scary thing is the military is probably developing, but I don't know that for a fact, but to just sort of believe it. There's your paranoia for the day. But they also address real world problems in these books, and they have been for a long time, going back to Captain America, who famously punched Hitler how many times and sold war bonds. Superman in the 70s had 70s and 80s had an ad that championed the idea of an all-inclusive, all-America, where you didn't discriminate based upon age, gender, religion, ethnicity, or nationality, where you came from. All America means accepting everybody. It was the message of the ad that was in print. But we also see superheroes taking on problems and offering fanciful solutions, but they give us hope that there are solutions, I think. Whether it be the famous issue of Green Lantern and Green Arrow, where they take on the drug problem for the first time. And it's an interesting backstory on that. Stan Lee had done the same thing with Spider-Man, not as in your face as the Green Lantern and issue was, and Green Arrow issue was. But the comic book code of authority, which is that little stamp that you see in a lot of older comic books, had prohibited the portrayal of drug use. and comic book artists were always wanting to portray what's going on around them. They were told you can't. And so Stan Lee just came along and said, hey, what if we don't put it on there? Who's going to stop us? Well, the sales will hurt. Let's try it. So he did. It sold like wild cakes. Wild cakes, is that a word? Sold like wildfire, and hot cakes. Wow, I mixed two metaphors. Anyway, but then after that, we lose this comic book code of authority, and you get a superhero stories that are more confrontational and dealing with real world issues. Black Panther famously fighting the Klan and championing against racism, or I put the Superman and Batman up there because I think we've all been fighting the plague for a while. They fought it earlier, so it's an ongoing issue. And then one of my more recent favorites, Miss Marvel, championing voting rights and going to the polls. And we'll talk a little bit more about her going forward here. And then obviously there's also the sort of famous initial series of Wonder Woman, where William Marsden created Wonder Woman with the idea that his sort of idea that and sensibility that women should be in power and women should be in power over men. Jill Lepare's book on that is something I would recommend for those who want to know the full story of that. It's not really PG, but basically he imagined Wonder Woman as this ultra feminist who championed women's rights and saw men as being dominated by war, hate, greed, and lust. And that's why Hercules was a villain. He was masculine in every sense of the word. Wonder Woman was not going to be that way, and she was became a champion for women's rights, famously denying, refusing to marry until all evil was gone from the world. Of course, later male writers changed that so that she did end up marrying him. But anyway, appearing in Miss Magazine as well as in other campaigns, and she became this sort of champion for rights. And we now today see a very diverse multiverse. The universe of these characters has become more diverse as the audience has expanded, and as quite honestly the companies want to expand their readership. But in doing so, kids reading it, adults reading it, see the portrayals of characters who are powerful, who aren't necessarily like themselves, but then it's also an opportunity for people who wouldn't have seen characters like themselves for the first time. They have a champion, they have a hero, they have this myth that they can adhere to. And it's easy to sort of dismiss and say these are just children's stories, but they matter to people. They really do. And what my research with this class has shown me is how much they really matter with people or to people. I won't go over all of these, but just a very diverse universe. Sana Amant, who is a Marvel editor, she was born in New Jersey. She is a Pakistani American, and for her growing up, she had trouble finding characters that she could really appeal to or were found appealing. The X-Men was the one that she liked the most, and thus I think that's maybe how she found her way to Marvel eventually. But as she said in this interview, everywhere I looked, particularly in the media and pop culture, were versions of people that looked nothing like me. What happens is when you see that, you think that you're not worthy enough, or you're not good enough, or you're not normal, really. And this is a sort of foundational to much sociological and anthropological research on race and identity. Having somebody to look up to is important. Having someone to be that person who goes forward, and having the Marvel universe and the DC universe reflect an audience and reflect the culture it's from is important. And I think it's very valuable. And for Amant, I always say her name wrong. The creation of Miss Marvel, who, how many people have seen the Miss Marvel TV series? There's a handful. Disney Plus. I'm not advertising for them, but it's a really good series if you want to follow. But when this comic book came out, it was a huge hit almost instantly. It swept through the Comic Cons as people dressed up as this hero, seeing someone who they identified with for the first time in many cases, but in other cases just liking the character. It became in the end, she's the first Muslim character to have her own comic series. And that's kind of striking to me in many ways that it took so long, but it's also important that it actually exists. It's a Hugo Award-winning comic book, graphic novel, highest grossing new comic book in 2014, the year it came out. Very influential as in the subculture of cosplay, as the photos show. But recall, in imitating the exemplary acts of a god or a mythic hero, or simply by recounting their adventures, we detach ourselves from profane time and enter a sacred space. And this, when we think about the cosplayers here, they are entering a different space. It's not just dressing up as a hero or a character. There's something else that goes on with cosplay that's different than your Halloween parade. Cosplayers are acting out that character. And we see that in people's reception of the book as well. The book itself was interestingly designed. The first issue of the graphic novel version was designed so that you can place your face over top of behind hers and become that character. Your own costume is right there in the I should have brought my copy. We could all take photos later and post them online. But the idea of seeing yourself in that character and seeing that character in you is part of why I think these mythologies have such salience. And she becomes very central to political action. In the follow-up to the presidential election where the previous guy won, you have there was a ban on Muslim immigrants into the country. And one of the characters that appears in those protests is not Wonder Woman, but Miss Marvel. She becomes the face of the superhero face of this protest. And a number of online magazines and newspaper reporters noted this, but you see it on television where people are using Miss Marvel as a voice for a different kind of social organization, as a voice for who they want to be and the worlds they want to live in. So she becomes central in political action the way that other characters have in the past, just like Captain America fought Nazis. She's fighting against, in this case, people are using her to fight against what they see as a wrong. And I won't leave this up long because I find this ad so offensive, but in 2014 and 15, this ad appeared on buses in major cities throughout the country. And it's a problematic ad. It was paid for and sponsored by a designated hate group based out of Houston, of all places. Imagine that. Basically, if you went to the link, you would find all this sort of negative information about being Muslim in Islamic countries, and highly critical. Miss Marvel appears to take over, to reframe the message. Artist collectives start taking Miss Marvel images and posting them on top of the ad itself throughout the country. Again, showing how these characters are more than just stories. They do something for people. They empower people to do things. And I think that cosplay is one of the areas where you really see this most prominent. There are a number of charitable groups in town that cosplay, and I want to start by talking about them. Heroes with a Heart, I think they may have sort of faded away a little bit during the pandemic. Maybe they'll get back together, but the other one is Caps Crusaders. They're both active in San Antonio area. In many communities throughout the country, you'll find groups of cosplayers that engage in charitable acts, embodying those characters, going to children's hospitals, visiting with the sick, cheering them up, providing some sort of inspiration for them. It's good work, right? And it for the people who do this, what they say is that, it really makes them feel good, but they really enjoy the experience of seeing those kids' faces light up when they appear as their favorite character. Heroes with a Heart will also dress as Disney princesses, depending upon the activity that they're going to. And they appeal to different audiences, depending on what they're doing. One of the things that I found interesting in talking to the various cosplayers and people who cosplay at Comic Cons and things is it doesn't just make them feel good to talk to other people about it and to engage with an audience who is a fan of that character. It changes how they think about themselves in very important ways. Superman here told me that when he first put on his costume, he didn't quite fit. He was a little bit, it was kind of like, he didn't want to be the fat Superman, right? He was not muscular. He wasn't built. So he started exercising. and he lost weight to fit the costume, not because of health concerns or other things, because he wanted to be able to fit the role he was trying to play. And that's one of the ways in which superheroes have inspired cosplayers. And there's something to this. I was going to make you do this, but my family said don't. And that's the power posing research that's been done by Amy Cuddy, where you pose like a superhero before doing an activity. And she's a psychologist who used to be at Harvard. I don't know where she's at now, but in her research, she studied whether or not power posing changed how you think about about your abilities. And what she found was there were improvements in people's abilities to do certain things after posing like a superhero. And I always, when I teach my class on superheroes anymore, I have people stand up before an exam and power pose, and then we take the exam. Maybe it helps, I don't know. But at any rate, the idea of posing as a superhero and acting out your character's fantasies of being that hero, there's something about this that speaks to us. And it's part of the ways in which these myths help us. Okay. Another place where we see cosplayers is in creating their own costumes and then going out into the street and fighting crime. Seriously. Maybe you've seen the HBO documentary series on the real world superheroes. Get a chance. It's really fascinating. We don't have a group like this that I've identified in San Antonio. Maybe there is, but you find individuals doing this in Mexico, in Europe, in Africa, dressing up as a superhero and going out and actually fighting crime. Phoenix Jones is probably one of the more famous ones in Seattle. He's had his arms, legs, ribs bruised up, beat up, broken. And what he does is he goes out on a Friday and Saturday night and breaks up fights and calls the police when it's beyond his control or beyond his ability to do anything. I think he's retired now, probably for good reason. But Phoenix Jones is a character he created. He doesn't go out as dude in his normal everyday clothes and fight crime. He dresses up as a hero, and that transforms him into something different. It's a mythology he's created for himself. Likewise, the challengers that patrol Milwaukee or the Extreme Justice League, which are still active in San Diego area, they patrol likewise, often trying to trick people or not trick people, but to try to catch people doing bad things. And one of the things that they will do is they have a female member who will patrol ahead of them and try to provoke an assault, which is not something I recommend doing, but they're doing it because they believe that they're able to actually catch people this way. It's what's interesting to me about this is they don't do it out of costume. They patrol the streets in costume. They don't go out without that on. So there's something about being a superhero that's important to them in this context. Is there any real world superheroes here? No. So what do superheroes myths offer us? Now, I want to end with these 4 points today. One is they help us rework social relationships. They help us rethink our relationships to each other, across gendered lines, across ethnic and racial divides, religious divides. They are part of the way in which we come to understand the world. If you read the Miss Marvel comic book or watch the series, it's an honest, very not stereotypical portrayal of a Muslim family. It doesn't show the world as like 24 or some of the crime dramas will show a Muslim character. It's a very different type of portrayal and a very positive and affirming one that reflects the world that the people who write and read it sort of would experience. It offers models and counter models of equality and justice. Truth in the American way, if you want to add that on there. It helps empower social action. And it's a space of creative play. So viewing superhero stories as active myths, not just so stories, removes them from the aesthetic and discursive analysis that we're just analyzing the narrative structure of a superhero, as say Campbell would have done, and ties them more directly to our daily lives. It helps us to understand the popularity of Marvel and DC universe and the durability of comic books in an age where print media struggles to exist. Clearly, superhero stories, or what I'm calling superhero myths, speak to and through their audiences in important ways. In a world of political strife, of COVID, of monkeypox, of the war in Ukraine, the unbearable heat, climate change, economic upheaval, supply chain shortages of everything from avocados to milk, super myths provide hopeful narratives for us. They inspire readers and viewers, as well as scientists, to find just solutions and to think creatively about the world we live in or want to live in. At least that's the glass half full version that I'm offering today. That I want to thank you and thank the my department and museum and the students from my class for guiding me through this, and also say happy birthday to Dale if he's out there. Come on. It's weird to talk into a mic and not see anybody's faces. I'm used to lecturing to an actual live audience and seeing their faces. So there's time for questions. If anybody has questions, I think, I don't know what time it is, but yes. What got me? So the question was, what got me into superheroes? From the beginning or from this? From the beginning. So way back when. So when I was a kid, I was a huge comic book reader and would read mostly Spider-Man and Iron Man and Marvel comics. My friends and I collected them and shared them, and so I think it goes back to when I was just a kid and buying those comic books off a rack before even knowing what a comic book store was. Always trying to find the ones that weren't bent over. I remember that being important, but yeah, I still have them. They're in a closet somewhere. Yes. Okay. Okay. So Mike Brown asks about whether or not there's his understood him to be fictional. I don't think that they understood him to be fictional. They understood him to be a demigod, and so it gets to the sort of questions of belief. I mean, if we think about like Christian faith or Judeo-Christian traditions or other religious traditions, we take on faith those beliefs. Likewise, as we understand, especially in the Roman times, Hercules was a religious figure of sorts, part of the pantheon of gods that did exist, or demigod, being the son of Zeus or Jupiter, depending on the mythology. So, yeah, I think that there is evidence that I mean, there may have been skeptics, but when we're talking about that kind of time period in the past, it's hard to really. I'm not an expert in Hercules, I should say, first of all, but it doesn't seem to me that people viewed him any less than as a god, and that's why he was venerated. And you see these sort of things worshiping him. They're probably skeptics, though. Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, that's a good question. The question, I'm going to repeat it a little bit because I think the Zoom audience can't hear the audio. The paraphrasing what you just asked was basically following up on Mike's question. Is there a sense at which superheroes are kind of replacing or supplanting or being used instead of contemporary theology? Basically, is that the gist of it? Yeah. I think there certainly is a degree to which that's the case in terms of filling that space that people sort of the imaginative space that people have and particularly as our countries become more secular, superheroes become more prominent. But I think there's also a space at which superheroes address things that our contemporary theologies don't. And so even for people who are religious, very religious, they still have meaning because they are addressing sort of real world concerns and fears that aren't always addressed in the Bible, for example, in the Quran. I mean, they're real world problems that it's hard to look to for that kind of help. I mean, I think of the military industrial complex being one, or gun violence or crime. We don't, there's not a lot of guidance that we get about military industrial complexes from the Bible. Warfare. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is quite a bit of interest in the cosplay community. So the question was about whether or not modern day fandom is creating their own and reimagining their own mythologies. And I think that in the cosplay and community, there is quite a bit of interest in just that. You see a lot of people doing what we call crossplay, where they dress as an opposite gender. So you'd have a male dressed as a Harlequin, for example, and thinking about what that would mean to have that character dressed, that character exist, and imagining that, or doing mashups where you combine characters that may not have existed in other places, like uh, creating a Lego version or a Star Wars version of Superman. What would it mean to be, Darth Vader as Superman, for example? I mean, I've seen that cosplay. I myself dressed up one year, and I was going to put photos, but I don't have a good photo of it. I was the dude from The Big Lebowski crossed with Iron Man. So I was the Iron Dude, right? I had the robe, I had the wig, and I had a rug that tied the room together, but the rug also fought crime. So, and I had a little glowing chest piece. Yeah. Yes, in the back there. I recognize you. Yeah. So the way, I mean, yeah. So I usually teach this class, and it basically we read comic books, and that's what students are assigned to buy. So they buy the comic books. Miss Marvel, The Watchmen. We're reading Batman this year, and the Japanese comic Battle Angel, basically. Yeah. And so that's what we're reading this year, and but I try to touch on the same points still. The goal has always been to kind of sucker students to take the class and then hit them with some theory, right? And so they get into the class, they think, yeah, we're going to be talking about superheroes, but we're going to be talking about superheroes in light of theories of ethnicity. And that's a way to get students who normally wouldn't take an anthropology class, as well as some majors, to sort of engage in this conversation. What I've tried to do more and more is emphasize the cosplay portion of it. And I think that's going to be a larger and larger portion. And then also the creative aspects. I've had this year, I'm asking some comic book writers to come in and talk to the class about the creative process of creating characters, and thinking more specifically about the ways in which we create characters for the class. Yeah, but it's kind of the same, but the cosplay has become much more and more prominent. And with so many cons happening in town nowadays, it's easy to, cosplay means costume play. I should have defined that. I just make these assumptions, but we try to emphasize more and more that aspect of it is where I'm hitting. I didn't teach it during the pandemic because there's no place. I mean, if the class needs a Comic-Con to go to, and if there's no Comic-Con, there's no way to actually teach that class. So I'm happy to be able to offer it again now that they're kind of getting back to some normal, the new normal, or no normal, as Ms. Marvel might say. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was about the changing gender dynamics of comic book fandom. Yeah. I mean, I was I guess I was naive and didn't think about girls when I was collecting comic books because during recess I was the one out there with my repulsor rays attacking everybody. Awkward. But with friends who are probably on Zoom right now listening to this, and they know exactly. And I created my own superhero too at a young age. I was Captain Crazy. Um, my parents literally met at a mental hospital where they were employees. The story goes. But I created a character based upon that, and I had a pet sidekick that was invisible named Freud. That was an ostrich. So I was not worried about girls. I think. But the idea of the fandom changing. I mean, when I first proposed this class, I imagined I was going to be talking to a room full of dudes, and it was mostly women, and it has been every time. And I think part of that is that anthropology itself kind of makes up as a discipline is 50-50 in our classes, maybe greater female representation increasingly. But I think the movies, most people aren't fans of the comic books, male and female in my class. When I survey them, they're fans of the movies. They're fans of the TV shows, or they just like the characters. And the characters have also diversified, and I think that's part of it. When you go to a comic book store, and I don't know if you've been to one recently. Oh, right, right, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely changing, and in good ways. I think part of it is a reflection of the industry itself changing. Um, the authors and writers are diversifying, and I think that's also very important for the genre. Sana Amant created a character that, like her, is Pakistani American teenager growing up in Jersey and fighting crime with superpowers. Yeah, in the back there. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that and I mean one thing we didn't mention was the cartoons really came on before the movies, and kids would grow up watching the cartoons. And I think that's also an important aspect of that. So you see them in more places than you would have before. Is there another question you had online, or is it too late? Oh no. Um, my favorite superhero. So I've always been a fan of the womanizing alcoholic Tony Stark. I don't know why. My first comic book that I purchased was him in the gutter with a bottle of alcohol. My and my mom was like, "Why do you have that?" Um, but I told it it's a redemption story. He's becoming something greater as a result of these trials and tribulations, and so that's always been a fan, and I've always been a fan of Peter Parker as well. I think, and I actually thought it was kind of appropriate that Tony Stark, Peter Parker is doing this particular exhibit, just because it's he has the right name. He's a bit of a superhero himself, so it makes sense. Okay. There's no other questions, I guess. You were calling, you were saying that was a good fun final one. Thank you, Gina. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Halvaksz, for this great talk. The exhibition will be closed on September 4th, Sunday. And before that, Professor Halvaksz will come back, give another gallery talk on August 23rd. Thank you for joining us today here in this room, as well as online from around the world. So we look forward to seeing you next time in our future events. Thank you. Thanks for coming.